Good morning. It is last Thursday of the month again. We have Artist Forum here at the center. My name is Itumeleng Waluhulere. I convene the Factory of the Arts, and we invite different artists every last Thursday of the month to come and talk about their artistry, and some academics also, because this space we want to share between artists and academics, and we can see commonality in our different types of research and work. Therefore, this time we've invited Ralph Borland to come and share the experience of his work and what he's doing and his pedagogy in terms of his work and group of people that he works with. Well, Ralph Borland is a South African artist who has worked at the intersection of art, design and science and technology for close to 30 years. He studied sculpture at the University of Cape Town and the creative applications of electronics and computers at the University of New York. While pursuing his transdisciplinary PhD in engineering at Trinity College, he started working with Science Gallery International, curating public exhibitions that brings together work of artists, designers, and scientists. But it goes on and on and on and on and on, Ralph. But anyway, I want to welcome Ralph into Ajatsiba Lab, where we are based. Therefore, Ralph, welcome. You're at home. You'll find some artists here and academics here who are doing some work that's similar to you. We've got Ukwanda downstairs who's doing puppetry. Therefore, just want to say welcome and please be free. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. You can give me some not actual feedback, but tell me if my mic is in the right place. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, thanks very much for the introduction. I'm excited to talk here at the CHR. There are many similarities and overlaps between my work and the work that happens here, particularly with the theme of puppets here and the laboratory of kinetic objects. And in fact, Kim invited me to talk about some of the work I'll be talking about today several years ago to come and present my work with African robots in connection with laboratory of kinetic objects. So one of my focuses is on the automaton, which is like a puppet that's operated by a machine. So that's one of the strands that I'm going to play on here. So ASH is an acronym I came up with about a week ago, which is Art-Science-Humanities. And I did this because I've talked about my work as being art science for a long time, and that's a recognized term, is art science. I started to realize recently that humanities is also playing a role in my work, especially the theories and tools to decipher and critique technologies come from the humanities, so from areas like science and technology studies and history of science. So I added the H, and I've got ASH, and you'll find that there are variations on this term to do with combining those three fields. So there's quite a lot I'm going to leave out today. I'm not going to talk about my exhibition curation. So as Atumeleng mentioned, I do work for Science Gallery International. I've done a number of exhibitions. I'm not going to talk about some of my public artworks that are in Cape Town that you can see. Say by Jetty Square, there are some skeletal sharks haunting the foreshore that you could check out. But I've had to leave out quite a bit from my presentation and focus on a few themes. There's still a lot in there. So let me begin. So this is one of my early artworks. This is a manipulated found object, which I made when I was about 5 years old in Cape Town, and my parents still have it in a cupboard in their house. So I photographed it when I saw them last in Zimbabwe. So I grew up in Cape Town, in Mowbray. I was born here in the 70s and 80s. I spent a lot of my time going down to the corner cafe and playing arcade games and reading comics. And in the mid-80s, my family moved to Zimbabwe, which is where my parents are from. So I went to high school in Zimbabwe and came back down here in 1994 to go to art school at Michaelis. That's my rough timeline. And that's why I tend to call myself Southern African, to be both South African and Zimbabwean. And of course, there's a lot of movements across all of our borders within Africa. Funnily enough, there are these strange links between my practice today and this little object, in that this is the lid of a wonder box, which is that contraption made in South Africa with polystyrene beads inside a bag that's meant to help cook and save energy. So they've been around since the 70s, 80s. And it's this idea of a small-scale intervention to help people save energy or make their lives easier in resource-poor environments. And that ended up being what I focused my PhD work on. And I'm also really into birds, and there's a bird in there as well. So the first work I'll show you is my final year work from my art school degree at Michaelis, 1997. The work was called Transwerk, which is from the Transwerk's railway yards in Salt River, not far from here. And I did this large-scale installation of sculptures that I'd made from salvaged polyurethane foam. So I'd go out in the early morning to factories in Montague Gardens, and I'd collect their waste foam and bring them back to my studio, glue them together and sculpt them. And I also salvaged speakers from radio and TV repair shops and built multi-channel sound arrays. And then I was also a promoter, a club promoter and a DJ outside of art school. And so I brought that into it as well. And I DJ'd through all of these different sound sources and created a sound sculpture site-specific work. And that's me in my work clothes, having been awake for at least 24 hours finishing my degree work. Yeah, that's what it was like. So I won the class medal for sculpture, so it was worth it. I'd failed my mid-year exams, and then I did well at the end. So I'm showing you this because it contains things that you'll see as we go: an interest in sound, an interest in popular culture, an interest in sites and environments, in performance, and also just broadly in technology. So as a sculptor, I was really interested in how can I get to learn how to use electronics and sound in my work. And because of that, for my master's, I went to a program called the Interactive Telecommunications program at New York University. Someone had recommended that I apply. I applied, I got some partial scholarships, and I went over in 1999. And one of the works that I made when I was there with two friends of mine in my class were these performance suits. So I worked with Jessica Findley and Margot Jacobs. We called ourselves the Mille Fiore effect. And we created these suits that were sound responsive, that inflated in response to sound. So they were a pair of suits. We would put them on people at exhibitions, and then if you growled or shouted, a microphone picked up your voice. It made parts of your suit inflate and parts of the other person's suit inflate. So you'd have defensive and offensive air sacs, like you're a lizard or a frog or something like that. We used hair dryers as our inflation devices. So we hacked hair dryers, and we sewed together just from ordinary like sheets of plastic bags. At home on our sewing machines, we sewed together these suits, and we ended up taking them to many exhibitions and conferences. We took them to Cuba in 2003 for their digital biennale. So it was great. It was a very fertile, amazing environment to be in, studying for my master's, learning about how to do all of this stuff, how to program microcontrollers, how to work with technology. Hey, how's it going? So this interest in sound and interactivity and performance, and some kind of drawing from nature. We were imagining that we were creating ourselves into animals and blurring these lines. This work led to my master's thesis work, Suited for Subversion. So for this work, I extended this idea of an inflatable suit, but what I was doing was responding to the activities I was engaged in outside of the university, which were street protests. So America at that time, I moved to New York 1999, September 11th happened 2001, and I was there till 2003. And post-September 11th particularly, there was a lot of anti-war protest and just a great deal of social unrest. And I would take part in protests of hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. And something that I was responding to was the way that the police would control protests and channel you through, allowed corridors, and you couldn't really transgress. So I was looking at social movements who would make themselves body armor and form shield lines against the police, and also at other groups that were doing carnivalesque, playful tactics in order to draw attention to the causes in different ways. So I ended up making a suit that had a pulse reader inside it and would transmit my heartbeat out of my chest so it was audible to other people. And part of the concept was that if you had a group of people wearing these suits, they could link arms, make a kind of a barrier, and you'd also hear all of their heartbeats beating in a syncopated rhythm, and you'd hear when they were afraid and hear when they were excited. So it was this gesture that I would call simultaneously sort of arming and disarming. It's a disarming suit of armor as part of how I described it. And this work ended up being selected for a show at the New York Museum of Modern Art in 2005 called Safe. And then the museum bought it after the show and made it part of their permanent collection. And then they showed it for about 10 years afterwards. And something that I really was interested in about this was the suit wasn't actually very good practically at what I was saying it was for. I mean, I knew that I was making a sculpture and a performance work, so I didn't think it was purely practical. I thought it was doing a number of things. But I made one that was stuffed with newspaper instead of inflated because I couldn't get the inflation right. And I was actually afraid to wear it to protests in case I got knocked over and suffocated in it. So it wasn't really very good at the function it's meant to work for, but it became very good at telling a story and communicating to audiences, and that's how it got taken up. And the New York MoMA gave me and the other artists, all the media, and then it was printed out in 2005. So they gave me like an inch thick stack of all the media coverage of the suit. And my suit was on the front page of the New York Post, the tabloid in New York, and it was on TV channels, and it was in all different kinds of media. So I got really interested in what is this idea of combining functionality, an artwork that's meant to do something for the user, and that communicates to audiences. And that became the line that I pursued for many years afterwards. I'm going to mention an artwork that I did post my master's when I was back in South Africa. And this is also involving multi-channel sound, so taking it back to my art school work. It's called Song of Solomon. I think there's an audio clip that will play. So this work is an 8-channel sound installation. We've done it once as a performance on stage, where there's no people. There's just a machine, a computer program that plays from about 70 different versions of Mbube or Awumawe in its later remix version. And I did this work with Julian Jonker, who's now a legal academic, and back then was studying law and was a cultural activist, and we used to DJ together at parties. And so he approached me and said, I'm really interested in the story of Mbube that Rian Malan had told in Rolling Stone, and that Francois Verster had made a movie about called The Lion's Trail, which is about Solomon Linder in the 1930s recording the song Mbube, which is the name of a genre of music as well as a particular track, and being paid 10 shillings for it, which was what he would get paid to perform at a wedding, and having no rights to the song after that. And then how a record found its way to America. Pete Seeger made music with it, and then it ended up being transformed later on into The Lion Sleeps Tonight and being in The Lion King. And it made something like $15 million over its lifespan. Rian Malan for Rolling Stone wrote about how Solomon Linder died in poverty and how his descendants were living in poverty while Americans were making a lot of money out of this music. So 2006 was when the court settlement was reached that finally gave an undisclosed sum to Solomon Linder's descendants. What we wanted to do was we wanted to create a work that both celebrated Solomon Linder and the struggle and his family, but also provoked questions about the application of intellectual property law, because it's great when you can use intellectual property law to benefit the people who have lost out, but also cultural production can be stifled by the over-application of intellectual property. And in fact, Mbube, as I mentioned, is the name of a track. It's also the name of a genre. It was one track that stood out from a much wider cultural practice. And with Julian being a lawyer, he wrote a legal opinion about the legality of the work that we created, about all the laws it contravenes. We created a program to sample 70 versions, reperform them, selecting from randomly at first, and then recreating the original track, and then going out of sync again until it fragments into the Muppet Show version of Awumawe and so on. And this is all performed in a semicircle of 8 speakers as if it's a choir, as in the Isikatamiya or Mbube genre. So we called the software program Morpheus, which was partly a reference to Orpheus Macadoo, who was an American minstrel singer who came to South Africa in the 1890s, performed here, and they had this big influence on the advent of isicathamiya and mbube as song forms, as music forms. So it talks about this transatlantic influence and about how music constantly gets created through copying and remaking. So we produced something that was a legal provocation and was trying to do something ambivalent and something with tension around intellectual property. And after that, in 2006, the same year that I made this work with Julian and was showed at Red Eye in Durban, I moved to Dublin and I started my PhD. So the date on this 2011 is the end of my PhD, 4 or 5 years later. And this section of my presentation is less about making art. I didn't make art for my PhD. I intended to, but I ended up just doing a traditional large piece of writing for my PhD. But the subject matter and the way that I inquired into it was influenced by art. So the Radical Plumbers and the play pump on the left, first of all. So the title of the PhD is Radical Plumbers and Play Pumps. The play pump is that object on the left. So in 2006, this was a hugely popular South African invention that got many millions of dollars of support from the US, from PEPFAR, and from sales of One Water, and got a good deal of press coverage. It was the idea of a children's roundabout that would pump water, store water in a tank. They'd sell billboard advertising on the tank. That would pay for the maintenance of the pump. It was presented as a way of getting water to rural communities in a way that didn't involve work, people walking for water, and solved the maintenance problem, which is the biggest problem in this kind of project through this commercial revenue model. I saw this and I thought, it looks like an artwork because there's so much here that is about communication to audiences. This combination of children and play, and the idea that you can get something, an essential good, without water, seems like it's got a lot to do with the symbolic storytelling capacity of this technology. I'm also skeptical of the idea of advertising being a means to raise money for a rural project. But I think it's really interesting. I want to find out more about this project and I want to critique it and analyze it. At the same time, I want to compare it to the other landscape around water in South Africa, which is, well, at that time was groups like the Anti-Privatization Forum, who were social movements who were fighting the commercialization and privatization of water and were fighting a constitutional court battle for the right to water, which they ended up losing at the end. But they were distributing leaflets saying, destroy water meters. They were going on protest marches in which they were taking prepaid meters out and returning them to the city governance. So there was this antagonistic response to commercialization of water on the ground in South Africa. And at the same time, there was this project which presented this very digestible image of children's play producing water. So I thought, I want to look at these two things together and understand what's happening with them. And so I went deep into the history of appropriate technology. That movement started in the 60s and 70s, people like Ernst Schumacher, where the interior of a technology is very important. That's why I've included this diagram of the interior of a Zimbabwe bush pump, which is an appropriate technology icon. It's a water pump which is cheap to produce, very reliable, you can fix it easily, produces a lot of water, and there's no fuss to it. There is some attention to its appearance. They say it works better if it's brightly colored. There's something that the makers talk about. But essentially it's about a quiet technology that serves the people who need to use it, and it's good at what it does. It costs about 1/10 of the play pump, and it pumps water, I think it was about 5 times as well as the play pump. But none of that was possible to decipher at the beginning of the project because there were no studies of the play pump. And the other lens that I used to look at this area was interventionist art, in which I looked at devices like Parasite, this artwork by Michael Rakowitz on the top left, which is inflatable devices he made for homeless people in Boston, which plug into the waste air ducts of buildings and provide warmth and structure. importantly, what he said about his project was, this is not meant to solve homelessness. This is meant to draw attention to homelessness. It's a temporary intervention. It's about engaging with people. It's about getting this into public attention. It's not about solving it. Whereas the play pump said it's going to solve the water problem. The small image below is of Christoph Wojcicki, who ran the interrogative design group at MIT. And again, it's a homeless vehicle that looks like a missile going through the streets of New York in the 1980s. He would design apparatus for homeless people to sleep in, collect recycled goods, and so on. And on the lower right is a work by Judy Vertine called Brinko, where she designed shoes for border jumpers from Mexico into the US. And she designed them to reflect the needs of the people who might be trying to cross the border illegally. So on the inner sole, it has a map of the border region. It has a compass on it. It has the patron saint of border jumpers on the heel of the shoe. And she sold these shoes as upmarket sneakers and then gave the money to causes for border jumpers. I was just thinking about how this would go down right now in the States. Even at the time, it caused a huge media firestorm. So she was then on TV all the time with CNN and the American outlets, with people going, how can you do something like this? It's so irresponsible, or why are you facilitating border jumpers? But again, it was a mode of creating a functional object as an artwork that actually engages with a real situation. And she's equipping people to do something, but clearly it's a minor intervention in terms of what it's practically going to accomplish. And it's not meant to be really a solution to anything. At the same time, it's equipping individuals and it's directing attention to a cause. So I was interested in that. And then the image above, top right, is by Childo Moreles, who's the Brazilian artist who was working particularly in the 70s and 80s during the military dictatorship in Brazil. And he had an artwork series called Insertions into Ideological Circuits. And what he was doing was things like taking recyclable Coca-Cola bottles and printing his own messages onto them and then putting them back into circulation again. There were a range of messages. Some of them were said, Yankee, go home. Some of them had recipes for a Molotov cocktail on the outside of the bottle, so you could transform this bottle into a petrol bomb. So this was in a state of real repression in Brazil, where people were being disappeared by the military police, and there was no democracy in Brazil. So I was really interested in his approach as well, it's pre-internet and pre any of that, but he makes this statement about how there are circuits in society, and you can inject your messages into these circuits and they will passively carry these messages. He also did it to money as well, so you would stamp messages on money. And it's this gesture of artists in the South using interventionist art as a means of speaking back to power or circulating messages of resistance. So I was thinking, yeah, how does this all help me to read what the play pump is doing? And the other area I looked at is critical design. So critical design is an art-like form of design undertaken by designers. Some of the main people are Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, who now lecture, I think, at New School in New York. And they're industrial designers by training who produce objects that are not meant to just be useful. They're meant to imagine future societies or draw attention to social problems. So if you look at the two columns, A is traditional design and B is critical design. So instead of consumer, you think about citizen. Instead of making us buy, it makes us think. It's this form of design that, like interventionist art, is questioning what designed objects should do. And then I did a bit of field work where I went into KZN and I went to the sites of play pumps, and I saw scenes like on the left where you have these play pumps in the middle of nowhere with no advertising on them and no people around. Because predictably what happened is, after the first rush of interest in them, companies realized there's no advantage to us in advertising to poor rural communities, so they stopped advertising. There was no revenue. And because the play pump, along with a whole new movement of design for the developing world, the broader field I was looking at, they tried to undo a whole history of appropriate technology engagement, which was based on community involvement in technologies, where they said the community around needs to be brought in to maintain technologies. And it's a very imperfect system. It's very difficult to do right. But at the same time, it has all of these advantages in terms of robustness, and it's about trying to work out how you can do that well. But the design for development field that came later said, let's make it into a business, let's generate money for it, and let's get people from outside to come and do the fixing of the technologies. But as soon as the revenue dries up, there's nobody there, and the people don't live there. They have to come from Johannesburg or Cape Town to do it. Also, what people would do is they would hack the play pump, where it's actually not great for the user to have to pump the water up to this big tank before they can use it, especially if the play pump is not being used often. So people would sometimes dig up the pipes right next to the play pump so they could access water directly from the pump, because that's what a pump like the Zimbabwe bush pump does. And those two pictures on the lower right are from another water NGO who started to reveal what was happening with the play pump, which is that children's play was never going to be enough to produce water for the community. Even if they played 24 hours a day, they still wouldn't produce enough water, because a consequence of the play pump's design is that they had to compress the pump's mechanism into a small space to hide it in the roundabout so that it would appear magical. But that meant that the pump stroke was so short that it didn't produce enough water. So children's play was never going to be enough, and then children got bored with it and didn't want to play with it, and adult women ended up turning it by hand at the end of the day, and that was a much less efficient way of using a pump than what they had before. And the play pump wasn't just adding new pumps. They were often taking out of the ground existing pumps like the Zimbabwe bush pump and putting play pumps there. So communities would have their technology replaced, and there'd be an initial surge of interest and enthusiasm, and then they'd find that they have this deficient technology that makes their lives harder. And so at the end of my thesis, I produced these diagrams as a way of understanding what I was seeing with the play pump, about how you had these networks, and this is partly where Childe Morela's idea of circuits, ideological circuits, came in, where you have these networks involved in producing play pumps, in taking advertising on them. And part of this group at the top of this diagram is the audiences, the first world public. And they're the furthest away from the play pump on the ground. And they're the people who receive images of the play pump managed by all of the other groups in between. And so people in Europe and America see these videos and images of the play pump, and part of my work was to document all of these responses, and they think it's incredible. They think this is an amazing project and they want to support it. What I imagined is that there's almost like a screen that separates the play pump on the ground from the audiences in other countries, on which are projected all of these images and videos, and they can't see what's actually on the ground. And the people who use the play pump don't have the means to get those images to those audiences. So it's an illusion. And something that's fascinating about it is that the screen is a flexible screen that can even be present on the ground around the play pump. Because what some water workers would describe is that when foreign visitors and NGOs would come to visit sites of play pumps, suddenly children would rush out from the surrounding area and they'd start playing on the play pump and start spinning it around and demonstrating to the visitors how it worked and how enthusiastic they were about this technology. And then when the visitors left again, they'd stop using it and it would go back to being how it was. So there's this performance that happens around the play pump as well that also plays on these power imbalances between wealthy visitors who are influential, who can get you things, and poor users who don't have the power to resist this technology that comes in. So it's like a screen that persists all the way to the object itself. And the diagram on the right was what I produced as a conclusion, which was a tool to analyze objects in which you use this series of lenses to analyze them. And yeah, this is what 100,000 words and 4 years boils down to, this diagram. So it is just, yeah, it is just, I exaggerate, but it's a handy diagram to try and illustrate the area I was looking at, which is what happens when you have objects that have audiences in the first world and users in the developing world, and what kind of imbalances of power happen there. And if you tie it back to the artwork I'm interested in, that artworks have that property potentially of function for the user, communication to audiences, what happens when that function is put in the service of other power dynamics. So I'm going to go a bit into African robots and then bone flute, so 2 projects. How are you all feeling out there? That's about halfway through, or a bit more than halfway. Okay, good. So African Robots is a project that I started on my own initiative, 2013. I'd moved back from Dublin post-PhD. I'd done a postdoc at the African Centre for Cities in public culture. And I became really interested in wire artists. In fact, that I'd had this, I think I'd actually written up this project idea even before I started my PhD, I think in about 2008. Something that gives me reassurance is that I often have ideas and write them up and want to do them, and then it might be several years before I actually get to do them. Bone Flute is one of them, is one of those projects as well. But African Robots, I'd got the concept. I'd said to myself, I really think wire art is very interesting. I see people in the street making art and selling it. It's a form of public art. It's very ingenious. You take a cheap available material, you use your hand skill to make it into something interesting and with value, and you attempt to sell it. What if I could interact with the artists who are doing this? So this is my wire car from when I was a kid. So I made a little copper wire car as a kid in Zimbabwe because I was interested in copying what I saw around me. So I saw wire cars and I wanted to make my own. So it's very, very simple. Can you tell me what car it is? Yeah. Not a Beetle, similar shape. Not a Mini. I don't know if any of you know a car that's called the Citroen 2CV. You know the 2CV? There used to be one driving around Cape Town. It's a very iconic kind of appropriate technology car. There was one in Harare, so that's why I saw it there and thought it was very interesting. It's all made of flat panels. There were special versions that were made all around Africa as well. I think it's this car that the French hid the blueprints from the Germans when they invaded France because they didn't want them to get their hands on it. And part of the brief was that it should be able to carry 4 farmers and a pig across a plowed field was the criteria for designing the deux chevaux, the 2CV. Just so you know. And this is a little car that I bought in the small town in the Karoo when I was driving through once. Very simple, very crude, but expressive of someone's desire to capture and represent something in their environment, often technological. And this is the kind of car that some of the wire artists I work with make, who started out as children making wire cars for themselves and for their friends. And if they were really good at it, their friends' parents would pay them to make wire cars for their kids. And that was their start as being wire artists, is when they were children. And the V&A Museum of Childhood in London has an exhibit of wire cars from Southern Africa. And they say that it dates to the 1950s. And it's often transcontinental trucks and buses that get depicted by children. So it's this fascinating childhood art form that's about representing technological objects in your environment and using your available materials to do it. And I love that kind of art. It's not art that is for an art gallery. It's art that comes up from people, that it expresses some kind of inner urge to make art and to represent. Wire art uses very cheap, simple materials, hardware store wire. This is from Proto Trading in Cape Town, 22 rand for a reel of wire. And it's the hand skill and the learning that enables people to blow it up into these 3-dimensional forms. I think it's almost like blowing air into a balloon. You take this line, you take the line for a walk, and you make a form with it. And this whole history of the line used to describe form is also really interesting. It's a drawing in 3 dimensions. This is Bongani, who's by the Newlands traffic lights with a bigger shark. And this is Farai and Lewis, who I've worked with for on and off for 12 years or so, with a huge shark that was a commission. And this is them showing it near their home in Delft. But something about wire art is that there's this glut of forms, of mass production. And there's a whole economic history to wire art, which we could ask me about at some point. But basically people from Zimbabwe came down to South Africa in the 90s and made quite a bit of money from selling wire art, came back with cars and money to Chitungwiza near Harare, and other people were like, we want to go do it too. So there started to be this whole industry. And in Chitungwiza, There is a big industry of people mass producing wire art by hand, and then people take it and they bring it to South Africa and sell it here, as well as people here making their own work. So as always, you have this whole scene of people who are very like artistic and independent and make their own things, and you also have people who are more like traders who sell these almost mass-produced objects. So I wanted to do something that would stand out. I had an intern for a month called Henrik Nereshka, was an amazingly talented student in interaction design from RCA. He came to spend a month in my studio, and I went to the traffic lights and I met a wire artist called Dube Chipangara. And I put the two of them together, and with me sort of directing it. And I wanted to make a subject like an automaton. I thought what we could do with wire art is we could bring in some of the knowledge I have from my master's about how to use cheap chips, microchips and electronics and components, and animate wire art. I think that could be something that would make a distinguishing type of wire art. And African Robots is the name that I want to give it. So I love the starling. It was a kind of a research process of going, what do we want to make as the first African robot? And I thought the starlings are these creatures that move between nature and urban areas and are like little robots themselves, very nimble. So we made this little wire art starling. We downloaded free models on the internet of generic birds, made profiles, made it in wire, went to Nokia cell phone repair shops and took components from old Nokia phones like speakers and batteries, LEDs, and we used those as the components to make it, because part of what I was doing, informed by areas like critical design, which also has a mode called design fiction, is I thought it's entirely possible for wire artists and cell phone repair people to work together and make these things, but then they're not doing it, but I can imagine them doing it. And instead of just imagining it or writing about it, let's actually do it. Let's make the thing. And then the thing becomes a form of design fiction. So it becomes an object that is possible, but may not yet be happening spontaneously. So it's storytelling through making objects and products. And this is what we made. So I can see you responding to it. What do you feel? What do you feel in response to it?
It's somehow, even the sound sort of, it sounds like a bird, even though the mechanisms inside sound like the bird, even though it's not supposed to be,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense. So the sound kind of connects quite well to the animal.
Yeah. And I saw the expression on your face, and I thought it's this response that's to do with feeling into something, in a sense of, you just give something the smallest bit of life, and we start to feel for it. We start to say like, this is something that's trying to be alive in some way. And that's what I find fascinating about this area, is like animating, and then this idea of affect. Like, how do you see something that's almost more appealing the less slick it is, because it's not trying to deceive you, but you can still see that it's not real. It's more like it's trying hard. You're trying to be alive. You can all relate. You can all relate to the struggle. So I put the bird back into its context, and then it's talking to the other wire animals, saying, "Animate yourselves, activate yourselves." And then we made more developed versions of it, where I took plastic bottles and made transparent covers. And I made other birds with wire artists like barbets. So we have different modes of interaction, which I'll illustrate a little bit. But sometimes it's me as an artist, where I sculpt this beforehand, for example. I sculpt it in clay, bring in a wire artist. We work together to work out the best way of depicting it in wire. It was a commission, so someone paid for it, and then I art directed it and recreated this. I did the mechanisms inside it. And sometimes it's more like a workshop in which wire artists make what they want to make, and I facilitate it. So there's all of these different modes. This was made by Michaela's art students. I taught a class 2 years in a row in African Robots, where I brought wire artists into the academy, and art students made wire objects. You can see this red and yellow circuit board, egg-shaped circuit board. That's a custom circuit board that we developed for the project, working with a collaborator in London called Technology Will Save Us. And it was the idea of making kits and components that would facilitate doing workshops with wire artists to make interactive things. We've also done conferences where we do a day-long workshop with participants where they make an ant themselves. And this was our second circuit board called Little Bird 2 Tropicalismo version. This is when we went to Brazil, and we made a circuit board that allowed you to plug into bought toys, like cheap Chinese toys. There were relays on the board that you could use to like activate the toys and start to merge found electronics with your own bespoke electronics. And this is wire artists in Harare at Haifa, inspecting these toys from Brazil that I bought in these big multi-story markets in Sao Paulo, brought back to Harare for these workshops, and they were skinning them and stripping them and using the innards to make their own things with. And this is in Maputo, in the markets there, where I would run like a week-long residency with Pro Helvetia funding, where I would think of it as being like providing an art residency for wire artists and crafters, where I arrive with a whole lot of ideas and tools and technologies and say, we're going to pay for your time that's equivalent to what you would make or more from working. So let's just spend a week exploring what we can do with gears and motors. And also looking at what people do already. So that image on the lower right is someone showing me the motors that they salvage from tape players and DVD players and incorporate into their helicopters that they already make. So all of this is a dance with what people already do, but then amplifying it and combining it in other ways and using some of my training as an artist and a technologist to do that. And those are engineering students in the middle. So part of what I did with these workshops is I also paid engineering students to participate in the workshops so that they could interact with wire artists. And it's this kind of relationship making, which is also part of African Robots, which is the engineering students had never interacted with wire artists in the markets before. And they were really impressed. They came out impressed with the technological know-how of the wire artists. And for the wire artists, they had access to these university graduates who were from a different sort of social echelon in Maputo, but they were all working together on a project. So as much as African Robots is about objects, it's also about relationships. That's a light responsive owl we made in Durban, using some novelty spectacles from Brazil. This is a project that we've developed over a while. It's ZZ Nightlight. ZZ is the Shano for owl. We've got a solar-powered version. So this is the idea of getting into actual product design. So I'm constantly just following a lead and experimenting. So this is now more like, can we make a product? It's something that we made these for Spear Light Art. So we got funding to make 40 of them that went up into trees at Spear Light Art. And then we've been selling them and giving them away since. So it's got eyes that light up, marbles that light up, and it can be charged in the sun. And just to mention another international project, which was Anthropophagic Octopus, where I went to Korea and spent a month in Korea finding somewhat equivalent to wire artists there that I could work with. I ended up working with a sculptor who makes Buddhist lanterns and finding a subject, a tiny octopus that people eat in Korea, and decided to make a giant version of this octopus that would make sound. And this is the wire artist Lee Kisung, who I worked with. So I found him in the street and we ended up working together. And we made this huge octopus. Anthropophagic is to do with tropicalismo as well. In Brazil, it's the idea of eating culture from abroad and making it part of your own body. It's like an ambiguous kind of action of you consume global media, but you make your own, which is like K-pop from Korea. It's like a regurgitated version that then becomes dominant. And that's the sign that means robot in Korean. I thought it looked like a little person. And I'm going to flick through things quickly in the interest of time. So Spacecraft is an offshoot of African Robots based on the vector graphics of 1980s Star Wars computer games. I was interested in how icons from films like Nemo would find their way into wire art and then become very popular. I've also seen things like Black Panther masks for sale from wire artists, so responding to popular culture. And so I made these very meticulous things that look almost digital, like a 1980s wireframe, but are made by hand. And we did large-scale installations using this approach and made our own arcade game cabinet to display the pieces in, which I'd actually like to make into a playable computer game. And then we did our largest work. So in 6 years, from 2013, making a small robot starling by the side of the road, 6 years later, in 2019, we made this 6-meter long, half-ton spaceship sculpture that we launched at the Zeitz MoCA with National Arts Council funding. And this plays a version of the dub track Black Star Liner, and it plays on the history of Marcus Garvey and Pan-Africanism and African futurism and Afrofuturism in terms of this vision of transcendence or transportation and what technology can do with that. It's got lots of electromechanical sound elements in it. And it's all driven by a rotating oil drum with a pattern of holes in it that triggers sensors and triggers strikers and uses the dub sound system to make music. And the pilot considered the controls and manipulate echo and delay effects in order to create sound. So dub as a form from Jamaica is a form of transportation through technology. It's a form of transporting listeners from Jamaica to an imagined Africa in one interpretation. It lifts you out of your present site through using echo and delay and powerful sound systems. And that's something that we played on during COVID, is that we made a online virtual reality version of the sculpture called DigiDub Club, in which people could visit in VR a version of the sculpture. So these are people in their avatars gathering around the sculpture. And this is Dakar, where my wife Dara was with me, helping with the project where we exhibited the Dubship project, not as the physical sculpture, but as an augmented reality experience. And this is in Ghana, where the sculpture is now. The sculpture found a home in Ghana. And we created this augmented reality poster from which the spaceship emanates as an animation. So when you look through your phone using an app, you can see this animated version of the sculpture from the VR environment coming out of it. And this is what we currently have been working on, is a more just like an abstract sculpture called Hot Mesh, which has now started to become its own toy called XOX, which is a little interlocking system, which I have one in my bag if you want to see it later. And lastly, I will just tell you about Bone Flute, which is the subject which is closest to where I am now. It's the most recent work that I've done, and it's also been the most satisfying combination of art, science, and humanities in my work. And it's work undertaken in a university. I was working at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa, from 2021 to 2023. I did a work called Aesthetic Interventions in Artificial Intelligence in Africa, AIAIA, working for HUMA, on a project called Future Hospitals, in which the intersection we were looking at was Africa, technology, and healthcare. How do we find things out within that area? I came in as an artist, didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I was introduced to an orthopedic surgeon at Tygerberg Hospital, one of our biggest hospitals in South Africa, who was doing, this is Rudolf Venter, meeting me for the first time in the corridors of Tygerberg. And he is making cost-effective methods to 3D print patients' bones to practice complex surgeries on before surgery in a public healthcare setting. So he didn't invent the approach, but his appropriate technology-like approach is how to make this affordable and accessible within places like Tygerberg. I'm going to throw this in here. This was a past artwork of mine, which, along with Suited for Subversion, was about repurposing and manipulating body parts. So this is a work of mine called Handy Ears, which is to do with, if you put your hands behind your ears and you listen, you'll see that it changes your experience of the sound. So I made casts of my hands and made a headband that I could wear them behind my ears. Suited for Subversion was taking my heartbeat and making it audible outside my body. Now what I've wanted to do, again, an idea that I'd had actually 10 years before and never had the means to complete, was I wanted to take a bone out of my body. So I wanted to take my femur, extract it from my body using medical technology, not the real bone, but using scanning and 3D printing to take the bone out of my body and be able to hold it in my hands. And I thought I'd like to make a flute out of it and play a tune on my own bone. This is from the movie Metropolis, the early science fiction movie, in which a skeleton comes to life and plays his own bone. And I saw this many years before with a live scoring. And I was also aware of these images from medieval Europe during the time of all the plagues, in which skeletons were depicted dancing with humans, with people, rather, living people. And there was this idea of the dance macabre, the dance of death, in which everyone was participating, and also of the memento mori, the reminder of death. And I thought that what I'm going to make with Rudolf is I'm going to make an artwork which is a memento mori, which uses his technologies. By me making a sculpture I'm interested in making, I'm going to spend time with him in his laboratory. I'm going to find out what he does, and together we're going to learn something. And I was also interested in other cultural practices to do with making flutes from bone. These are Tibetan. And these are the earliest instruments ever found, are bird bone flutes. So there's this deep history of bones being used as instruments. I had my leg scanned in an MRI machine at Tygerberg and reproduced a 3D model of my bone, my femur. And that's it against my leg. I was surprised, by how large the bones in your body are, but that is inside you. And then I did an exhibition in which I produced images and video. These are medical scans of my own behind me. So I achieved my ambition of being able to play my own bone. Yes? I think my first influences were from visual artworks that were mainly European artworks that showed skeletons playing bones. And when I started to look into it, I found that in Tibet it's a practice. And then also that actually all over the world, there are, from Europe, North America, I haven't actually seen evidence of in Africa, but in definitely North America, Europe, and the kind of Indonesian kind of area, there are historical remains of human bones as instruments, and even current practices in places like Borneo, Sumatra, where you have instruments made out of bones. And it's a dual gesture. That this is what archaeologists interpret from, especially remains that are in Europe, is it can be to maintain power over an enemy when you take their bones and you make them into an instrument. And it can also be to maintain a connection with loved ones, where you have family members' bones. South America has that quite a bit. So yeah, there's this duality to it. Yeah. And this is the exhibition I did. So an exhibition called AIAIA. Dara, the filmmaker, helped me to make a short film of the operation, where I worked with Rudolf Fenter and the musician, and Alessandro Gigli and myself. We all operated on the bone together using the same processes that the surgeon would use to practice surgeries. Dara made a short film about it, which was screened in this exhibition along with the object. And there are these rearrangeable images on the walls in which I created a space which I could use as a performance space to tell people the story of the project. This is a still from the film in which we're all measuring and cutting together. These are visitors to the exhibition on the exhibition opening. This is Rudolf Fenter talking at the exhibition opening, in which one of the things he said was what he got out of working with me on the project was, he said when he describes what he does to general audiences, they don't understand what he's talking about. And he gave a demonstration of the technical language that he uses, and then he says people go, oh, I don't know what you mean. He said what I brought to it was a way of storytelling around it, that people get the impact of what he's doing. And so there was a collaboration or a sort of a shared benefit in what we were doing, in that I got to make an artwork, he got to communicate his work, but also on a personal level, we just really enjoyed our interaction. From the very beginning, we were discussing science fiction and music and art, and it's this way that I think something that working as an artist can offer is when we go into institutions, we manage to cross boundaries and get access to things in ways that might be harder for people from other disciplines, because we kind of slip through the cracks and we end up being able to transgress and transverse and then make connections between people. And this is my way of looping bone flute back to African robots. Is I have a proposal to make an automaton with the flute, which will be a snake that plays the flute automatically. And it comes from, first of all, just the form of something that would be efficient at wrapping around the flute, covering all the holes and getting to the mouth. That's how I came up with the idea of a snake. And then it creates this image of the medical image of the staff and the snake. And again, the snake is also an image that appears widely across cultures as a symbol of medicine and of spirit and of the afterlife and the underworld. And there's a whole story entwined with this project as well, which I told in the exhibition, which is about my own personal experiences being a patient within the medical system during the course of my fellowship. So I ended up also being a patient as well as a researcher and an artist, and I combined all of these strands in the exhibition I did at the end. So that's it. This is my Instagram handle, which is, if you look at the Linktree link on my Instagram, that's probably the best way to like link to a range of my projects, because I now have about 10 websites and I don't maintain any of them properly. So you can get a good view across them all. Okay, thank you very much.
After listening to Ralph, and I thought the reason why we started the Artist Forum, that in the past couple of years, the collaboration that have happened through the Artist Forum, like we know some of us will remember, between Reza Kota and Datin Mzai a long time ago when we were based at Chapel Street. And now I'm listening to you look at collaborations that you go through, artists and academics and doctors. And some of us who have been in the art industry for some time have done those collaborations. I think for me, it is the key to a strong artist pedagogy and artist practice when you work with other people of different disciplines from your own discipline. And I think we as artists need to get to do more of that. And I'm really impressed by what you're doing. And I think for me, I'm really impressed. And I think we should do more of those collaborations and get out of our comfort zones. So for us to be able to be much more creative. And I'm thanking you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And if anybody's got questions, you can have time to have questions to Ralph. Thank you.
You have crazy ideas, man. So 2 questions that I have. So I saw that you did something at Zeitz and you mentioned National Arts Council. So I wanted to know, did you go through the route of applying like everyone else, or how did that collaboration come about? And how did it end up at Zeitz? So that's one question. Mm-hmm. Second question is, how do you stumble on your ideas? Like, do you download them? Do they come to you in your dreams? Do you like through conversations? How does an idea spark and stick into your mind and sort of forces you to like want to bring it to life, you know? Yeah, those are my 2 questions. Thanks.
I gave a presentation a week or 2 ago for this new get-together called Art Massive. It's like a public thing that's organized by Playtopia you can go to once a month. They had the inaugural one, and I made my subject of my 10-minute talk, where do ideas come from? It's particularly on my mind because my most recent work, Hot Mesh, came to me in a dream. So I was waking up in bed and I had this vision on the edge of waking of this complex interlocking pattern. And so when I woke up properly, I sketched it in my notebook. And when I got to my studio, I did a rough model in plasticine and I cut it up and worked out how I could make it in real life. And it's been very generative from that. It's like a gift in my sleep from dream to make something. And I think, it's influenced by a lifetime of interest in that subject of patterns and how things work. But it's I see it as a gift. It's like something that has been generous in giving me this vision that's led to lots of other things. But what happens after the dream is also, I think, part of my practice is to keep following what you could say, following your nose, that expression, which is this like being led by what's in front of you, you know, so one thing leads to another. And if you can sustain your interest and interaction with something, and also something that you should learn at art school, I think I maybe learned it after art school, but I'd like art students to learn it, is the more simple models and depictions you can make of something, the more you'll learn from what you're making. So the fact that I made a rough plasticine model and then I made another demonstration, and everything that I did led to more. So you can just keep on generating more and more ideas. And the other idea of other place that ideas come from is experience, and especially childhood experience, because a way that I've started to think of what I do as an artist several years back is that I'm a filter. You could say a funnel as well, so like a funnel or a filter or some combination of those things, where part of gaining confidence as an artist, which has only really happened to me in the last 5 years probably, where I've started to learn how to value intuition, is that your experiences are good enough, as in your particular mix of influences is what you have. And of course, you're always learning and taking in and so on. It's not about not doing that. But if you ask yourself, why do I want to do this? Good question, but at the same time, maybe just follow what it is that you're being urged to do. So for me, some of my influences are reading comic books from when I was 5 years old at the corner shop. They were playing early arcade games at the corner shop. You know, there was living in South Africa in the 70s and 80s in a highly politicized environment. That was moving to Zimbabwe in the mid 80s and being part of that new imagination, you know, and being exposed to people making things of all different kinds of forms around me. So all of those influences come through, and sometimes you can go, oh, I'm just making what my 5-year-old self was interested in, but that's worthwhile. I think that's good, and that's good enough. So there are many. So those are some of the places that ideas come from. Then about the Zeitz. So there was an exhibition of Zimbabwean paintings called Five Bob, and I know some of the artists who are involved. And I went to the exhibition opening, and I managed to hang out long enough that I got to be taken up into the dinner afterwards. It's like the poor artist hanging out, hoping that they're not invited, but they're hoping they can get in for a free dinner. So I got in and I wanted to see if I could get introduced to Azu and Mabogu, who was at that point the acting director. So I asked somebody I knew, and they made an introduction at the dinner, and I just introduced myself and I said, yeah, I'm doing this project with Wire Artists, and probably showed him a picture on my phone of the owl, I think, that I just made. And he was like, oh, it's really exciting. We're planning an Afrofuturist show. Do you want to come and have coffee sometime in the week at the museum? So I said, yeah, I'd love to. And when I met with him, I'd put in this application to the National Arts Council to make a spaceship that played on the idea of the Black Star Line shipping company. And it was just a sketch at that point. So I showed it to him and said, this is what I'm planning to make. I don't have the funding yet, but I'm waiting for the outcome. And he's like, well, if you get the funding, then talk to me, because maybe we could put it on the show. Got the funding, invited him to my studio. And before he got there, I did a quick Photoshop mock-up of the sculpture hanging in the middle of the atrium of the Zeitz. And I was like, this is crazy, but I almost didn't show it to him, but I was like, okay, I'm going to show it. And then he's like, that's incredible, you should do that. So I was like, wow, okay. And how am I going to do that? And that's people's personalities, there's a whole range of personalities, but Azu as a personality was very open. He was just like, I don't know how you're going to do it, but do it. And he was very like, not very rules-based, not very bureaucratic, just more like, that excites me, give it a go. And then I was given the space to very independently pursue this project, where I just called on all of my resources to get people involved, to get help with what I was doing, to get people to offer their skills. And I saw it as this incredible opportunity to do something with this high visibility and respond to this like architectural space. But it was all done on a shoestring and with a great deal of help and generosity from a lot of people. But it was an amazing opportunity that happened through trying to push something and progress something.
I've got a phrase hanging around my head that you used with regards to a project. I forget which one, but it was something about a dance with what people are already doing. And as you know, we've got a new chair here on digital humanities as a kind of co-evolution of the digital and the human and so on. And the idea, you know, that you're proposing your projects of technology as embedded in the everyday already, you know, is so productive. You know, that it's what people are already doing, or maybe it's an incoming technology that's being hacked or subverted or redirected and so on. I just wondered if you could speak to the link between that capacity for like the self-invention of technology as an everyday urban innovation that people are doing for themselves, with the context that we're sitting in of like a fast urbanizing, fast changing cities of the South, because a lot of your projects are also in those kinds of contexts. And yeah, what link that holds for you.
Technologies are all different potentially. Like when we talk about technology, it's of course a very huge and wide category. And technologies have properties and tendencies, and that I have this feeling that there's something particular about mobile phones, for example, and certain forms of connected networks like apps and social networks and so on, that are maybe, yeah, of course they do offer potential for people to interact with them and direct them to their own purposes, but they're also more and more powerful and more extractive. So one of the examples I think of is that in OBS, I see all the motorcycle delivery men on the street corners waiting to do a job. And whenever they're not working, they're on their phones, and they're all sitting next to each other, all deep into their phones. And it feels horrible to me. It feels like there's the sort of the utopian idea that's been sold with mobile phones and access in places like Africa is fishermen are going to be checking prices of fish at the different markets, and then they're going to get the best price for their catch, and they're going to be learning on Wikipedia, and that's great. But I think what people are doing is, from the appearance of how they're using their fingers on their phone, is that they're just scrolling endlessly through stuff, you know, and that the phone is serving an extractive function. It's like, it's a way of getting a device into people's hands that you can monetize their engagement with media. And so that's like when Alan Not Craig or whatever, like the former CEO of Vodacom, has got this project with fiber of putting fiber into poor areas of South Africa, and that's being sold as this incredible social intervention to get people cheap internet access. I'm like, what are people going to be doing with that internet access, and what's your interest in it? You know, like, and so there are huge interests in getting devices into people's hands, and how do we turn that around or use that technology in ways that are emancipatory or give people agency or allow them to do something different with it? So the Nokia phone, I think, was an interesting moment because it's when the phone was there and it didn't have any internet access. It was for messaging and phone calls, and it was cheap and available, and we repurposed the parts that were still large enough and extractable enough to put into other objects and use them for interaction. You're going to have a hard time using an iPhone now to make an African robot with. You know, everything is black boxed. It's gone down to like a microscopic level in terms of the technology that's used to make it. So I guess what I'm communicating is some degree of pessimism around our ability to repurpose certain kinds of very advanced technologies. Similarly with AI, I think that I'm very interested in critiquing and analyzing AI and seeing what can be done with it. But it's also so powerful. It's technologically powerful. It's got huge moneyed interests involved in it. How do we turn something like that around? And so, as much as we can say broad things about technology, like it's always possible to repurpose like technology, there are always affordances to technologies that are beyond what the designer intended. You can say those broad things, but at the same time, we can also differentiate between types of technology and whether they are more or less open to someone being able to repurpose them.
One very, to me, striking political significance for what you're doing, for what you've been presenting throughout the segments of your career that you've been speaking about, is the importance of play and how play translates so negatively in our Calvinist context. Yeah, this is not play. We are dlalisa. Yeah, so there's always an undermining of play, particularly because it seems to always so often to be paired with indulgence. And what strikes me about the water pumps we were talking about, that function, aesthetic function, communication thing, is how what was happening with the play pumps is the deformation of play, such that play now was supposed to have a particular function. And those kids now might have been forced to go and roll around in that play pump, so it's no longer play. And that seems to have a strong correlation with doctrines of development, as we were talking about. And so everything must be captured. So most centers for African studies do not talk about literature, play, beauty. It's about how do we make people less poor? How do we get them soup, not nice soup? So there's something quite defiant, and not defiant in the way that they would like, because they would like an angry Africa, but there's a defiance in the insistence of play. And I thought that was really, really beautiful. And because of that, I was wondering how you would imagine an African robot in the form of a lion to lie there in front of all those speakers while you're playing and deconstructing Mbube. Because then the lion will not be sleeping. Will the lion be doing something with our motion sensors? Will the lion have marbles? Like, what will be happening? Because the lion has never slept. And whatever happened, whatever they tried to do with Solomon Linda's memory didn't really work. So I just wanted to say thank you, and thank you for putting play, not just improvisation, not just speaking back, but actually reveling and re-enchanting the world beyond what these technologies would like us to use.
I'm definitely going to investigate that idea of a lion. I can imagine him just like twitching his tail and blinking his eyes and kind of taking pleasure, because I mean that's what big cats and all cats do, is they like to just lie in the sun and enjoy. Like there's no productivity for a cat. Yeah, so I like that, and I also think that when you mentioned the re-enchantment of the world, that's something I'm engaging with at the moment, is that whole notion of the technological, the industrial age de-enchanting the world, and the possibilities for re-enchanting it, like reanimating the non-human world. And just one word about this performance of play with the play pump is something that I really was interested in, is this idea of scripts. So technological scripts, as in almost like a form of code or writing that says you need to use this you need to perform to use this technology. So instead of children spontaneously playing with something, the technology requires you to play. It's written into it. And then later on it became women are required to turn this children's roundabout in this very like undignified, uncomfortable way. But this is the script, like a script in a play that's written for the object. So, and then there's this idea of scripts and counterscripts. So how do you descript an object? How do you like question and critique and strip away the script? How do you write your own script? So instead of being made to perform to a script written by somebody else, how can you write your own script? Or even descript, which is what you're talking about, I think, is like where there's a certain agency and freedom and non-productivity to what you're doing.
Those machine technology that you show in terms of knowledge to manage, as you explain now, as I said that the question is more or less there, but it's still there to know how those children understand to manage and to maintenance of those machines in access of water and communities. Did you see, or in your research comparison, different machine the community use, how the people know to maintenance, to play, to use those technology to have access of water? Need more deep about that. Thank you.
I mean, I have a 2.5-year-old kid, and he loves to do the real work that adults do. Like he likes to pick up a broom or a brush, or he wants to do the work that he sees adults doing. So in a way, we maybe don't need to infantilize, children to say, you must do something that is like on a piece of playground equipment. Perhaps doing what adults do on a smaller scale is maybe pleasurable for a kid as well to do. also that maybe instead of installing play pumps, they could have installed Zimbabwe bush pumps and a jungle gym, and then they could have like had both and not had them combined. I mean, part of the way that the project was sold was on the idea of magic. So that sometimes they would call it the magic roundabout. And the idea of magic is that you can get goods without expending effort or work. So there's like the magic standard is, and European folklore is full of it, and it also comes from other countries as well. There's anthropological studies of the Trobriand Islanders. There's a famous text by Alfred Gell, which is about the belief that the ultimate standard for accomplishing something is that it should be done through magic. And in European folklore, there's stories of magical objects like a magical axe or a magical salt grinder that produces things without work. But the moral of those stories is always that things go wrong. It's always that it's like the salt grinder won't stop producing salt and gets thrown in the sea, and that's why the sea is salty. You know, or it's the magician's apprentice in Walt Disney's Fantasia who thinks that he can bewitch a broom to do his work for him, but soon the brooms are multiplying and he can't control them. And there's this deeply embedded idea that wishing for something to be done without effort is ultimately going to bite us back. You know, so we have to be prepared to spend effort. So yeah, in terms of children in those environments, yeah, so you don't want to romanticize children having to do hard labor to accomplish essential things for their community. But you probably also don't want to say that children don't want to do some of the tasks that need to be done in the community, and that doing something like using a pump that works efficiently and well along with other people could also be something that kids enjoy.
I'd like to take this moment to thank you, Ralph, for an inspiring talk.
Thank you,
very
Tumuleng.
much. And thank you guys for coming to our talk today. I hope to see you again in the last one next month. I will see the notices that we send out who's going to be our artist next month, but it will be our last one, I think so. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Comrades, thank you.